Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to this conference. It's nice to be here and nice to introduce my friend Peter Gualt. I'm a longtime education journalist. I write about a lot about low-income kids. I also am director of strategy at the Edwin Gould Foundation in New York City. We fund organizations that get low-income kids to and through college. In my capacity as a journalist and in philanthropy, I'm in a lot of low-income schools. And what I see is in many, many high schools, there are many, many children who are unable to express themselves clearly through the written word. Their reading is not very good. Their speaking and listening skills are not terrific. But when it comes to writing, they crater. This is very disheartening to me because what I see in our economy is that there are very few opportunities for, except at the lowest levels of the service industry, for people who can't write, for example, email and express themselves clearly in email. So what's happening in this country? It turns out that about 50 years ago, back when we only really cared about educating sort of middle-class kids, teachers taught, in elementary school, taught grammar and sentence structure, all those things that kind of make us cringe now, right? And later in high school, kids were taught to put together paragraphs and essays. And about 25 years ago, a new kind of pedagogy swept in, and teachers began to believe that writing, when you taught writing, you could, instead of teaching it, kids would sort of catch it. So it was caught and not taught. And so the idea there was you put kids in, you give them fun, interesting assignments, and you put them in a social environment, and they write sort of spontaneously. And as a result of those changes in pedagogy, we now have only about 1% of high school students can write a sophisticated essay. And the data tells us that about 70 to 75% of kids in the 4 through 12, measured from 4th grade to 12th grade, are very poor writers. So 75%. So things are not going that well with writing instruction. And but what's happening now is we find with the Common Core, we're at a new moment. Where people are beginning to realize that in order to move forward in the Common Core, students need to be able to write to study, to write to learn, to write to connect ideas and networks of knowledge, and to extend their own ideas. And what's happening now is there's a big scramble going on as teachers and schools and districts try and help their kids move through the Common Core to find ways to teach children how to write. So they not only want to prepare them for the Common Core to pass the Common Core test, but also to prepare them for college, because you know that you can get kids to college. What we find at the Edwin Gould Foundation is that you can get kids to college, but if they're not academically prepared, if they can't actually write, then then access doesn't really mean that much. It seems that, so in the Gould Foundation, we started funding some explicit expository writing programs, one of which is rolling out in Washington, D.C. It's called the Writing Revolution. And it's in about, I think about 16 schools now, and going very, very well. It's also in New York City. So that's one program that we've been looking at. But I also wanted to introduce you to Peter, and so that you could hear a little bit about his work. I actually just wrote a piece on Medium. It's awkward that I'm here because I just wrote a piece on Medium to say like how much I hated ed tech. And so here's my ed tech developer. So I bring you this as a skeptic, okay, as an ed tech skeptic, because I worry, okay, in a lot of education technology that poor kids get the iPad and rich kids get the Socratic method, okay? So I'm aware of the downside of technology, but I have to say when I see something that's really great, that I think is really positive and really promotes deep learning, I can pivot, I can learn, I can change. And so I want to introduce you to Peter and have him tell you about the exciting work that he's doing.
Great. Thank you, Sveg. So I'm sure everybody here believes in writing, right? That we grew up, we went to college, we had some great professors that really challenged us and really forced us to really articulate our own ideas. But we see that this is a very complex process, right? That writing is a very difficult, there's a lot of skills that go into it. And for a lot of students, they just don't get the right foundation to really excel. So at Quill, what we're doing is we're building tools that help students develop every aspect of the writing process. So when we launched, we started with grammar, right? It's not the most fun topic, but it's absolutely essential that you know these basic skills to get started. Since then, we've been building tools focused on storytelling, vocabulary, having students write together. And our vision at Quill is to have students write in every aspect of the process, to get them writing essays, to get them debating ideas, to get them critically thinking. So that's really our vision with Quill. So I'm here to show you some of the tools we're working on. We're a nonprofit organization. We're new. We just launched at the beginning of the school year. But we've got a big vision to really engage students in the writing process. And we see educational technology as being really valuable by enabling writing where it wasn't happening before, right? We're trying to replace multiple choice questions and all these really poor, lackluster forms of learning and provide something more engaging. So I'll show you, take a quick look into this, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So right now we have 4 tools that are live: Quill Proofreader, Quill Grammar, Quill Writer, and Sentence Shuffle. So I'll take a look at the first one. Here you can see in this passage there are 3 grammatical errors. Hopefully you can find them pretty quickly. This was inspired by a teacher named Laura Gibbs. And Laura would provide her students with a 2-page essay that had 80 grammatical errors in it. And she found this to be extremely valuable because it was a diagnostic. She could see the strengths and weaknesses of each student. The downside is that it would take Laura over 20 hours to grade this one activity, right? So Laura was a super teacher, and she would just spend her whole weekend grading all these grammar assignments, right? So we'll go through it, right? The students will go through, they'll proofread it. It was supposed to be in animations. Fortunately, it didn't work. But you can see the students find and correct the errors. And then once they're done, they are given feedback on their work. Now, again, Laura would spend 20 hours doing this, and the average teacher doesn't have 20 hours to spend on this one activity, right? So I met Laura through an online course and thought, hey, this would make a really fantastic tool. So we partnered with her. She was our first champion. And since then, we've rolled this tool out, and we now have over 80,000 students that are using it nationwide. Since then, one of the pieces of feedback that we got from teachers is they wanted to get their students writing together. There's a lot of instances of students writing by themselves, and while that can be good for some instances, it's also really meaningful to have students collaborate with one another. So we launched this tool called Quill Writer. It pairs 2 students together, and they're given some words, and they use these words to write a story. So here the first student writes, I scaled the mountain. And the second student then writes, an eagle soared over the summit. And really, we're in classrooms, we're testing this right now, and we see that kids love this because they love writing together. That so often in writing, kids are just told to write into their journal, and then it goes into a black hole, right? No one ever reads it, no one ever sees it, and it's really demotivating. Our job as educators is to motivate kids, to get them excited about writing. So by creating these collaborative experiences, this is a chance to say, hey, let's get writing together, let's start working together, and kids love this. So we really see this as a really exciting opportunity for us. We also provide teachers with a dashboard. They can choose their activities, and they can view all their results in real time. And then they get a report at the end that shows them how their students are progressing on the Common Core. And really, our vision here isn't to say that educational technology should never replace the teacher, right? We strongly believe that teachers have different perspectives. They can provide a lot of value in nurturing students and turning them into strong writers. But what we really want to see is more writing happening in the classroom. And technology can enable students to have these writing experiences that they just wouldn't be able to have otherwise. So we see this as a really exciting future, and we love that there's so many supporters like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as people like PEG who have supported us and made this possible.
So we're going to have more a conversation between Peter and I, and then open it up to the rest of you. So one of the things that comes up when I talk to people about writing and try and tell them about what's happening and not happening in classrooms is that, and show them fixes, they often say, but this is so basic, that this is such a basic set of skills. And what I want to answer is that, yeah, but kids don't have it, and they're not getting it. Do you also find that feedback that teachers are not in a position to actually teach these basic skills, that they aren't really bringing these into their classroom?
Absolutely. I mean, we see, when I was learning grammar, I learned it in a hodgepodge way, right? That you learn little bits and pieces here and there. I'm sure that most of you guys learn grammar while you're studying a foreign language, right? Like that's when you actually go through it in a systematic way. And really, that's sort of why you see so many gaps here, that there's not a systematic way of approaching this. So students are just left behind. They can't understand these basic grammatical rules. They don't understand how to create complex sentences. And we expect them to write essays on the SAT, right, and they just don't have the foundation necessary to do so. So we really need to tackle every aspect of the writing process, starting with the foundation, to really enable kids to excel and to be able to become confident writers.
So is this a program where there's going to be some undiscovered Hemingway, untutored, who can go on Quill and teach himself how to write or herself how to write and then become a great writer? Is this something like Khan Academy where you can become an astrophysicist by following their sequence? Or how does it work? How does it work in a classroom? What's the proportion of, say, Quill time to teaching time that you think would be ideal?
So right now, we've built our activities to be about 10 minutes in length or so, and this was a really key piece of feedback from teachers. That teachers love using technology as a warm-up at the beginning of class or at the end. You know, they'll come in, they'll all do a Quill activity, and then they'll move on to the rest of the class. And that's a really great compromise, because students can come in, and each student's working on their own sets of activities, right? So some students are working on parallel structure, other students are working on subject-verb agreement. And that's fantastic, because each student is moving at his or her own pace. So we all get this, we see this as being so valuable, and I think that's the sweet spot where we want to be at, is to see that you spend about 20% of the class time on the computer, 20% of the time doing these activities digitally, and about 80% of the time working through the lessons together. And we think that's a really nice balance between those two aspects.
What do you think actually stops teachers? I mean, we know that there's a huge problem in writing in schools. The data shows it. We have Regents exams in New York, and low-income kids struggle horribly to pass the Regents because of the essay part of the Regents. We know that kids really fall down on word problems in math, that synthesizing your ideas through the written word turns out to be an enormous challenge for many, many kids, and many of them low income. So because we know this, but what do you think stops teachers from teaching this? What do you think is preventing it from being in the classroom already?
Well, we see that teaching writing is incredibly complex, right? That it's not an easy skill to teach. So really, I think our next step, at least, is to start teaching teachers how to teach writing, right? Like, that is the next step for us. And I think that's really our big challenge, is to say that we can turn teachers into great writers, and we can help them develop their students into great writers. But that's the first step, that if teachers aren't in a confident position to teach this material, then no amount of technology in the world will ever solve this problem. And I think that that's something that can't get lost, right, as we think about, you know, all this exciting stuff that's starting to come out now. So for us, teaching teachers, providing them with professional development, and really going through the really granular details of how to go through individual lessons is really key.
So you envision a time when there could be a Quill for students, but also a deep part of Quill for teachers to learn how to teach writing through Quill.
Exactly. And I think that's sort of, for us, an essential step to say that teachers really can create a lot of value in the classroom, but let's get them firing on all cylinders so that they can really make a big impact.
So like Khan Academy for writing for teachers.
Exactly.
Okay. So why do you think it's important that students, your own history is debate, is that right? You did a lot of debate in high school and college. Why do you think it's important that students learn these skills, that students understand how to express themselves? Not just how to express themselves, but how to express their ideas clearly in writing and in speech.
So I did debate for 8 years, and it was the most pivotal educational experience in my life, right? That going up on a stage and having to defend an idea is, you know, it can be nerve-wracking, but it's also really valuable. And that's really what we want to see kids do, is we want to see them able to defend their own ideas. You know, we believe in writing not just because it's important for the SAT, but because it's the cornerstone of our democracy, right? That we have students who can write well, who can articulate their own ideas and defend them. And this is what gives everyone a voice in the process. So this is the thing that motivates us, right? That we're really trying to say, hey, let's get the next generation writing. And we see there as being a huge opportunity to really do so.
And the flip side of that is when you don't teach kids to write, you basically are assuming that students will remain passive. And you're basically assuming that they will never have a way to synthesize their own ideas or to put them in the public space or to debate them as they need to as members of our democracy. I mean, I really worry about why I'm working on a book on literacy, and one of the things that motivates me is that I really worry what happens when literacy becomes so superficial in our schools. What what kind of passivity are we really engendering in students? And is that what we want? Is that appropriate? I think we need to not just produce receivers of information, but producers of information and producers of ideas.
Right, absolutely. So, and this sort of raises a really good point, which is that we see a lot of video-based learning today, right? That a lot of students are on their iPads and they're watching videos, and that to me isn't a win, right? That a little bit of that is okay, but we see, like, for example, I like watching cooking shows, but that doesn't teach me how to cook, right? It's watching these shows. You really need to get your hands dirty with the process. And for us, the future of education is having students writing, having them getting involved with the process, and being active. And that doesn't happen through videos. It happens through paper and pencil and through keyboards and all of these things. But that's necessary. We need to be very careful that we are creating active learning instead of passive learning.
On the way down here, we were having a conversation about paper and pencil, and it sounds very antediluvian to be talking about that. But when you're thinking about literacy and how to lay down the foundations of literacy, it turns out to be a key component. I guess that's the third tier of your plan for world domination. So how can we support teachers? What do you need to do? I mean, what I find when I go into schools is I find that teachers don't teach writing because they actually don't feel secure as writers themselves. They don't feel like they got the kind of teaching that they need, or instruction they need to actually be confident that they're decent writers, and so they don't feel like they can teach writing with any acuity. So a lot of what happens in schools is kind of a focus on personal narrative, that just express yourself and find little moments and tell us about how you feel about it, and a lot of emphasis on volume rather than precision of precisely expressing your ideas. A lot of teachers often look at kids and give comments like, well, you did really well in this because you really kept at it. And when I look at that, I really do want to shoot myself in the head, because really that's not what we want for our students, right? Length is not a sign of quality, right, in any kind of writing. As a matter of fact, I think it works the opposite. So, at times. So, what I see is that teachers need a huge amount of support, whether that happens in Teachers College, but I don't know if we can change that. Once they are in classrooms, I think it would be very, very important to supply some supports where they can quietly get up to speed on writing instruction, on expository writing instruction, so that they can deliver that to all kinds of kids. You know, it's less of a, when I speak to a lot of different audiences about this, and a lot of middle class, a lot of affluent parents that are like, I don't know what you're talking about, my kids got this. And I think that's right. I think in affluent schools, this happens because affluent parents demand that it happens. They are people who use the word a lot. They're lawyers and professionals, and writing is important to their work life, and they demand that their children get it. In middle-class schools, it's a lot different. It's really haphazard. And in low-income schools, man, I just don't see it. I just don't see it happening. And I hate to think that writing, that the ability to express yourself in print or through the written word is going to be yet another skill of the have and have-nots. I really don't want to see that happen. So to the extent that we can work against that, I think it's very important. So I guess we should probably take questions from the audience. Does anyone? Yeah.
My name is Martin Apple. I'm curious about one thing. If we look at what kids are doing in terms of communicating, they're doing it by texting, which is a great killer of spelling, or
Mine too.
The real deep thinking called Twitter. So if we're going to use those as the major mechanisms of communication, and they work, what's going to motivate them to change?
You know, I think Twitter is a great, really reveals, in some ways, what kind of instruction kids have had. Because there's stupid Twitter, and which I have a lot of in my Twitter feed. It's @PegTyre. Go ahead, say some stupid thing. You like everyone else on my Twitter feed. But then there's really smart Twitter. There's smart Twitter that takes a really complex idea and synthesizes it like a smart bumper sticker, right? Like when you saw a smart bumper sticker, right? You would, back in the day, you'd be like, you got it, because you understood that there was broad knowledge that was synthesized into 3 words on a bumper sticker. And it's the same way with smart tweets. Right? But the problem is, if you don't have that background, if you don't understand how to take a complex idea and make it and express it in a really tight way, you have stupid tweeters. So I don't think tweeting is any different than what the Jesuits used to make students do in the 1940s, which is take a paragraph and synthesize it into a single line. I think it's actually one of the components of clear thinking, but not for everybody. But you can also use it in a dumb way. Another question? All right, the mere mention of grammar, and everyone just lets like their eyes roll back in their head. It's not about grammar. It's about creating students who can produce knowledge, who can extend knowledge. Yes?
I'll just speak really loud. Okay.
Oh, good. Go, girl.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Walker. I'm a teacher here in the district. I'm just finishing up my 6th year. I taught 5 years at Anacostia Senior High School, and I'm now a teacher at E.L. Haynes Public Charter School up in Petworth. And I was trying to figure out a question per se. I mean, I'm a special education teacher. I've taught everything from the alphabet to trigonometry and everything in between. And I taught 9th grade English for a year to a variety of students, right? And thinking of how I could have used technology in my classroom if I had computers. That would have been really awesome. But since I didn't have those types of resources, thinking through this like gap in writing and how do you close that in areas where you don't necessarily have the access to technology, or what the timing looks like of how do I teach the student who reads on a 2nd grade level grammar, but I'm in 9th grade English and I'm trying to hold you to high expectations, and I have a student over here who will go crazy if I don't teach on a 10th grade honors level, right? And so looking at how can I use something like quill.org to span that large of a gap and at the same time be a good educator and do this small group instruction and the never-ending question of urban education, right? So then looking at, I guess you were saying that in the beginning only 1% of students in high school can write a sophisticated essay, but the majority of our conversation has been around the students like that I've taught, of how do you reach them, but how do you even reach the kids who do have this technology, who do have all these advantages? Like if only 1% of our high schoolers can write a sophisticated essay, I feel like it's not just this like grammar issue, right? Like where is the professional development for teachers? And I think at our school what we tried really hard to do for years was do that professional development, but you're like kind of grasping into thin air of like, what does that look like? So if you could design the professional development for a teacher who is in these situations, not just necessarily looking at how do I give you the technology or how do I give you this platform, like what can I do to create a team in a school building of writers as opposed to just the individual teacher here? What would that look like?
Well, I think it's a big question. You're kind of asking us like how to solve the basic problem of urban education, which is a urban public education, a broad range of learners. I would say that foundational skills, it turns out if you can write a strong, lean sentence, you can actually, and put a few of those together in a decent, understand order and why sentences should be ordered in different ways, you can actually write a pretty powerful paragraph and then a pretty decent passable essay. So it does, I do believe that it really starts with the sentence, but I also believe that it really starts with thinking. Like when you ask students to write sentences, you're really asking them to think clearly, because there's an intrinsic order, there's an intrinsic logic, the same logic as in the way that we speak and the way that we, in conventions of literature, there's a logic to that, and it reinforces the way that we want, the way that we want children to think, which is clearly. So I would say that foundational skills, while boring and while it makes everyone really worried when you talk about like conjunctions, because people are like, what are conjunctions again? You know, like, do I know that? I kind of know that. But you do know that. But I do think that that backfilling foundational skills, especially for kids who are not necessarily at grade level, and even those at grade level, can be enormously important.
Right. And you can't do that manually, right? If you're a teacher and you have 100 students, there's no way you can sort of track each student's progress. But with Quill, the students will sign up and they'll automatically be recommended activities based off their performance. So if a student's really struggling and needs that 2nd grade remediation, then the student will stay at that level and they'll keep working on those materials. And now, you know, part of your question was, how do you solve this problem if you don't have computers, right? So unfortunately, we haven't made the jump yet from digital to print. Maybe we'll do that at some point in the future, but I think the real vision here is to say, as a teacher, we can help you by giving you materials that really walk you through each step of the process, right? So that really that's what's missing. That's what's missing from some of the instructional material that says just go write whatever you want. Like that doesn't cut it. That's not sufficient. So we're working on producing print materials that work on a granular level of like have students identify strong verbs, right? See which students know verbs, which ones don't, right? And moving forward from there. So I think that really focusing in on really great materials for teachers and making them digital or in print can really help solve this issue.
Language arts teacher, and I just had a quick question, and I think you might have alluded to this earlier, but I was wondering if you have experienced any pushback from LEAs or SEAs on these activities, like the one that you just showed us on quill.org, not accessing students' higher registers of critical thinking. As someone who taught in a high-needs Title I school, I love the idea of having activities like that and posting student sentences and asking them to correct them, and the students loved it as well because they saw their sentences, you know, posted on the board. And I just felt like it was always kind of a compromise between the district and the state, because when they came into the classroom, they said this is something that should be relegated to a warm-up activity, like you said, or a bell ringer. And that, you know, while I understand, so I guess basically I'm saying, while I understand this is very important in terms of the mechanics is very important and subject agreement, all those things, I'm just wondering if, like I said, how you address that
Well, this for us is definitely we're just getting started. So we launched at the beginning of the school year, and again, with my background being debate, like that's what I want to do. I want to get kids debating ideas. I want them arguing ideas and having conversations that go to back to the bus and back home, right, where they're confident in expressing their own ideas. So that's very much our vision. Now it's hard to get there, so we're working our way towards getting to those more advanced skills. But for us, we know that we need to start with the foundation. That if the kids don't have the grammar, then it doesn't matter. Like the debate itself doesn't hold. It needs that foundation. So again, that's where we're moving, and I think that the literacy space is still very new. So, you know, there's math teachers have 100 tools that they can use to teach math, and if you're an English teacher, you might have 4 or 5 tools available. So it's definitely not, they've got in the short end of the stick right now, but there's some new stuff coming out, and I think that that's where the direction we want to go, is definitely getting kids into that critical thinking and writing. So we all know that that's really what we want, that's what we care about, and that's what we really want to see.
And I would say that you can't run before you can walk, and like you might have your overlords who are asking you to do deeper learning, but if you don't have the fundamentals, it's not going to go anywhere. And what we see when we look at kids in the 12th year is usually it hasn't gone anywhere. So I think that you have to take kids where they are and try and build them up to a place where they can express themselves at a deeper level. Give them the tools. You know, that's what I'm saying here. Give them the tools. But thank you very much for being our audience.